The hum of the Rolls-Royce engines on an Airbus A380 is a sound very few people in the world get to hear from the front of the plane. It's a whisper of power, a lullaby for the global elite. For most in first class, it's the soundtrack to another routine journey across the Atlantic. But on British Airways Flight 214 from London to Washington, that gentle hum was about to become the backdrop for a brutal lesson in power, prejudice, and the kind of karma that doesn't just knock on your door, it takes the whole house. One man sat quietly, reading a journal, his accent the only thing his fellow passengers noticed. They thought it was a joke. They were about to find out it was a judgment. The first-class cabin of British Airways Flight 214 was a sanctuary of muted luxury, a hermetically sealed world of privilege soaring 8 miles above the earth. The color palette was a symphony of deep navy, brushed chrome, and cream-colored leather that smelled faintly of wealth and polish. Here, champagne was not a celebration, but a default beverage, and the concerns of the world below seemed as distant as the patchwork of clouds. Into this serene environment stepped Dr. Kenan Adebayo. He was a man of unassuming presence, tall and slender, with a face that held the quiet wisdom of someone who has seen much of the world and judged little of it. He wore a simple, dark grey suit, tailored from a fine, lightweight wool that didn't shout its expense, but whispered it in the perfection of its cut. He carried no flashy briefcase, only a worn leather satchel containing a thick, academic-looking journal and a pair of reading glasses. He found his suite, 2A, and settled in with the practiced ease of a seasoned traveller, his movements economical and graceful. He acknowledged the flight attendant, a polished professional named Bethany with kind eyes, and a name tag that identified her as the cabin service director, with a warm, gentle nod. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice a rich baritone. "May I have a glass of still water with a slice of lime, please?" The request was simple, yet the sound of his voice caused a subtle ripple in the cabin's tranquility. It was a beautiful voice, clear and resonant, but it carried the distinct, melodic cadence of West Africa, softened and shaped by years spent at the University of Oxford. It was an accent of intellect and worldly experience, a tapestry of cultures. To Richard and Penelope Sterling, in suites 3D and 3G across the aisle, it was the sound of a discordant note in their carefully composed symphony. Richard Sterling was a man who looked exactly like his profession, a ruthless private equity magnate. His face was perpetually locked in a confident, slightly predatory smirk. He wore a Patek Philippe watch, so complex it looked like a dashboard, and his casual travel attire, a branded Loro Piana cashmere sweater, cost more than most people's monthly rent. His wife, Penelope, was a porcelain doll of a woman, meticulously maintained, her blonde hair coiffed into a severe but elegant style. She clutched an Hermes Birkin bag to her chest like a shield, her eyes darting around the cabin, constantly assessing and categorizing her fellow passengers. Upon hearing Dr. Adebayo's voice, Penelope leaned across the aisle towards her husband, her voice a stage whisper designed to be overheard. "Well, Richard," she murmured, a thin, cruel smile playing on her lips. "It seems the diversity initiatives have finally reached the front of the plane. How quaint." Richard chuckled, a low, guttural sound that was more of a scoff. "Don't be so cynical, darling. Perhaps he won the lottery, or maybe he's a rapper. They seem to have a lot of disposable income these days." He didn't bother to lower his voice. He wanted to be heard. He enjoyed the small cruelties of life, the little assertions of dominance that reminded him of his place in the world. Dr. Adebayo gave no sign that he had heard them. He simply accepted the glass of water from Bethany, who offered him a tight, apologetic smile. He met her eyes for a brief moment, and in his gaze there was no anger, only a deep, weary understanding. He opened his journal, its pages filled with complex equations and handwritten notes, and began to read, effectively erasing the Sterlings from his immediate vicinity. This, of course, only served to annoy Richard further. He was a man accustomed to reactions, fear, deference, envy. To be ignored was an insult. "Look at that," he said to Penelope, gesturing with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Probably reading some nonsense. Can't imagine he understands a word of it." The pre-flight announcements began, the captain's smooth British voice promising a swift and comfortable journey to Washington Dulles. The cabin crew completed their final checks. Bethany paused by the Sterling's suite. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, can I get you anything before takeoff? Some more champagne, perhaps?" "We're fine," Richard snapped, his eyes still fixed on Dr. Adebayo. Then, with a malicious grin, he added, "But you might want to check on our friend over there. Make sure he knows how to use the seatbelt. It can be terribly complicated." Bethany's professional smile didn't waver, but a flicker of cold anger ignited in her eyes. She had been flying for 15 years and had an almost supernatural ability to read passengers. The Sterlings were a familiar and particularly unpleasant type, the perpetually insecure who used their money as a bludgeon. Dr. Adebayo, on the other hand, radiated a calm and dignity that was exceedingly rare. "I can assure you, sir, all of our first-class passengers are quite capable," she replied, her tone perfectly even, but with an underlying edge of steel. She then turned her attention to Dr. Adebayo. "Dr. Adebayo, please let me know if there is anything at all you need to make your flight more comfortable." She had read his title on the passenger manifest. The emphasis she placed on the word doctor was deliberate, a small act of defiance. Richard Sterling scoffed. "Doctor? A doctor of what? Witchcraft?" Penelope giggled, a high, tinkling sound that grated on the nerves. Dr. Adebayo finally looked up from his journal. He didn't look at the Sterlings. He looked directly at Bethany, and the warmth returned to his eyes. "Thank you, Bethany. I am perfectly comfortable. I appreciate your attentiveness." The plane began its powerful roll down the runway. As the force of the ascent pressed the passengers back into their plush leather seats, the tension in the cabin was already palpable. It was more than just the rumble of the engines. It was the friction of two worlds colliding. One was a world of loud, brittle arrogance, the other of quiet, unshakable substance. As the coast of England receded below, the stage was set for a drama that would unfold at 30,000 feet, where there was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide from one's true character. The disdain was just beginning its ascent. Once the aircraft reached its cruising altitude, the first-class cabin settled into a familiar rhythm. The seatbelt sign pinged off, and the hushed ballet of premium service began. Hot towels were distributed, menus presented, and the gentle clinking of crystal and cutlery filled the air. For Dr. Adebayo, it was a welcome opportunity to focus. He was on his way to Washington for a series of critical meetings at the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and the paper he was reviewing in his journal was foundational to the proposals he would be presenting. It detailed a new econometric model for sustainable infrastructure investment in developing nations, his life's work. For the Sterlings, the cruising portion of the flight was their personal theatre. Freed from the constraints of takeoff, their campaign of petty mockery escalated, fueled by 2 glasses of Krug champagne. They spoke to each other across the aisle in voices that were deliberately too loud, creating an echo chamber of their own prejudice. "Richard, did you see the menu?" Penelope began, her voice dripping with faux concern. "It's all so complex, all these fancy French terms." I do hope it's not too confusing for some of our fellow travelers." Her eyes flickered towards Suite 2A. Dr. Adebayo, without looking up, addressed the approaching flight attendant. "I believe I will have the seared scallops to start, followed by the pan-roasted halibut, and the Chateau Montelena Chardonnay would be an excellent pairing." "Thank you." He pronounced the French terms flawlessly, his diction crisp and precise. The flight attendant smiled, genuinely this time. "An excellent choice, Doctor." Richard Sterling's smirk tightened. He had expected the man to point clumsily at the menu or mispronounce the words, giving him fresh ammunition. The man's effortless sophistication was infuriating. "Probably just memorized it," Richard muttered to his wife, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "It's amazing what you can learn phonetically." Throughout the meal service, the microaggressions continued. When Dr. Adebayo politely declined the wine top-up to keep a clear head for his work, Penelope whispered, "Probably not used to such fine vintages. Can't hold his liquor." When he meticulously arranged his silverware after his main course, Richard commented, "Look at that. So fastidious. Must have been a waiter in a past life." Bethany, the cabin service director, moved through the cabin with a practiced grace, but her senses were on high alert. She made a point of engaging Dr. Adebayo in conversation, hoping to build a shield of professional courtesy around him. "Is this your first time traveling with us, Dr. Adebayo?" she asked warmly as she cleared his plate. "Not at all," he replied, finally setting his journal aside and giving her his full attention. "I fly this route quite often. Your airline's scheduling into Dulles is the most convenient for my meetings in the city. Your service is typically impeccable." He smiled. "As it is today. We're happy to have you. Business in Washington, I presume?" "Yes. A series of discussions on global economic policy. Quite a bit to prepare for." His tone was matter-of-fact, devoid of any self-importance. The Sterlings listened to this exchange with unconcealed contempt. "Global economic policy," Richard mimicked under his breath, contorting his face in a parody of deep thought. "That's what they're calling it now, is it? Probably some UN handout scheme." Penelope added her own venomous contribution. "It's just affirmative action, darling. They have to give these people important-sounding titles to justify their presence. It's all for show. It means nothing in the real world, the world where you and I operate." This last comment was the one that truly crossed a line. It was no longer just a mockery of an accent or a presumed lack of sophistication. It was a direct assault on the man's legitimacy, an insinuation that his success was unearned, a token gesture. Several other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A silver-haired gentleman in moiré, who had been reading the Financial Times, lowered his paper and shot the Sterlings a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. They either didn't notice or didn't care. Dr. Adebayo, however, remained a fortress of calm. He had faced far worse than the pathetic snobbery of two insecure bullies. He had stared down warlords in war-torn countries, negotiated with intransigent dictators, and calmed entire villages on the brink of famine. The whispers of the Sterlings were like the buzzing of insignificant flies, but that didn't mean he was unaware or unaffected. He simply chose not to grant them the power of his reaction. He knew a fundamental truth that they, in all their gilded ignorance, could never grasp. A person's character is not revealed when they are respected, but when they are disrespected. He simply picked up his journal again, his focus absolute. This profound stillness seemed to provoke Richard Sterling more than any angry retort could have. He saw the man's composure not as a sign of strength, but as a confirmation of his supposed simplicity. He couldn't conceive that someone might genuinely be above his taunts. It's like talking to a brick wall, Richard huffed to his wife, finally slumping back in his seat, momentarily defeated by the man's refusal to engage. There's just nothing there. Bethany, having overheard everything, approached Dr. Adebayo's suite with a fresh bottle of sparkling water. "Dr. Adebayo," she said, her voice low and sincere, "I want to apologize for the behavior of some of the other passengers. It is not the standard we expect on British Airways." He looked up, and for the first time, a trace of melancholy touched his eyes. "Bethany," he said softly, his accent the very picture of cultured grace, "you are not responsible for the contents of another person's heart. Do not trouble yourself. A man who needs to announce his own importance is a man who has none." He then returned to his work, the whispers at 30,000 feet fading into the background hum of the engines. But the seeds of consequence had been sown. In the rarefied air of the first-class cabin, every action had a witness, and every word, once spoken, hung in the air, waiting for the inevitable moment of reckoning. The flight droned on. The Atlantic Ocean, a vast, wrinkled blanket of deep blue, slid by unseen beneath the clouds. The cabin lights were dimmed, and most passengers had settled in for the latter half of the journey. Some watched movies on their private screens, others dozed under cashmere blankets. Richard and Penelope Sterling, having exhausted their supply of cruelty for the moment, were now complaining quietly to each other about the quality of the claret. Dr. Kenan Adebayo, however, was not resting. He had his reading light on, his brow furrowed in concentration as he scribbled notes in the margins of his journal. He seemed to exist in a private bubble of intense, intellectual effort, a world away from the petty dramas of the cabin. It was approximately 4 hours into the flight, somewhere off the coast of Newfoundland, when the quiet rhythm of the journey was interrupted. A senior member of the cabin crew, a man with the distinguished air of a purser, approached Dr. Adebayo's suite. He moved with a sense of purpose that immediately drew the attention of the few passengers who were awake, including the ever-watchful Sterlings. "Dr. Adebayo," the purser said, his voice a model of deference, "my apologies for the interruption. We have the satellite link secured as you requested. The call will be ready for you in 2 minutes." He wasn't holding a standard airline phone. In his hand was a sleek, heavy-duty satellite handset, a piece of equipment rarely seen on a commercial flight and reserved for circumstances of extreme importance or emergency. Dr. Adebayo nodded, a hint of anticipation in his eyes. "Thank you, Robert. I appreciate you arranging this. Please let me know when you are ready." Richard Sterling sat bolt upright. He exchanged a bewildered and annoyed look with Penelope. Special arrangements? A satellite phone? What in the world was going on? Their entire narrative, that this man was an imposter, a low-level affirmative action hire who had stumbled into first class, was being directly challenged by this inexplicable display of special treatment. "What is that all about?" Penelope hissed across the aisle. "I have no idea," Richard grumbled, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "He probably paid extra for it. Trying to look important. It's pathetic. Who would he even be calling on a satellite phone? His witch doctor back home?" But his words lacked their earlier conviction. A seed of doubt had been planted. The purser's extreme deference and the presence of the specialized equipment did not align with their assumptions. 2 minutes later, as promised, the purser returned. He held the phone out to Dr. Adebayo. "The line is secure and the connection is established, sir. You are clear to speak." Dr. Adebayo took the handset. He pushed a button, and the small screen glowed to life. He held it to his ear. The entire cabin, it seemed, had suddenly become aware that something unusual was happening. The gentle glow of movie screens was ignored. Conversations ceased. An expectant silence fell, broken only by the ever-present hum of the engines. Dr. Adebayo's voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried through the silent cabin with absolute clarity. It was calm, respectful, and utterly authoritative. "Good afternoon, Mr. President." The words dropped into the cabin's atmosphere like a stone into a still pond. The ripples of shock were instantaneous and seismic. Mr. President. Two words that vaporized every snide remark, every condescending whisper, every ounce of the Sterling's smug superiority. Penelope Sterling's hand flew to her mouth, her perfectly painted lips parted in a silent gasp. Her face, moments before a mask of derision, had turned a ghostly shade of white. Richard Sterling froze, his glass of claret halfway to his lips. He looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. His jaw hung slack, and his eyes, wide with disbelief and dawning horror, were fixed on the man in suite 2A. The silver-haired gentleman in 1A, the one who had been reading the Financial Times, slowly and deliberately lowered his newspaper. He adjusted his glasses and stared openly, not at Dr. Adebayo, but at the Sterlings, his expression a mixture of cold fury and profound, undisguised contempt. He knew exactly what had been happening for the past 4 hours, and he was now witnessing the most exquisite, unanticipated reversal of fortunes. Bethany, standing discreetly near the galley, felt a surge of pure, unadulterated vindication. She watched the Sterlings' faces crumble, their arrogance evaporating like mist in the sun. Dr. Adebayo seemed oblivious to the shockwave he had just sent through the cabin. He was completely focused on his call, his posture relaxed but attentive. "Yes, sir. The connection is perfectly clear," he continued. "Thank you for making the time. I have reviewed the preliminary drafts from the Treasury, and I have some thoughts on the allocation models for the Sahel Stability Accord." He was not just talking to the president. He was advising him. He was discussing policy at the highest possible level with the leader of the free world from an airplane 8 miles above the Atlantic, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The unmistakable ring of the satellite phone had been a prelude. The true sound now echoing in the silent cabin was the shattering of prejudice and the deafening crash of Richard and Penelope Sterling's entire worldview. They had laughed at the man's accent, and now that man was speaking with the president. The phone call was not a brief courtesy check. It was a substantive, high-level policy discussion that unfolded in surreal detail within the confines of the first-class cabin. Dr. Adebayo, cradling the satellite phone, spoke with a fluency and authority that was utterly mesmerizing. He transformed his small suite into a mobile nerve center of global economic strategy. "Mr. President," he said, his tone one of respectful collaboration, "I concur with Secretary Peterson's assessment on the immediate need for liquidity, but I believe the proposed tranche distribution is too heavily weighted towards sovereign debt relief. It's a short-term fix that fails to address the foundational infrastructure deficit." He paused, listening intently. The one-sided nature of the conversation only amplified its weight, forcing everyone to imagine the powerful voice on the other end of the line. "Precisely," Dr. Adebayo continued. "My model suggests a tripartite approach. We allocate 40% to infrastructure, specifically water purification and localized energy grids. 30% goes to microfinancing for agricultural cooperatives, which will build grassroots stability. The final 30% can then be used for targeted debt restructuring. It creates a sustainable economic ecosystem rather than simply plugging a hole in a sinking ship." Richard Sterling felt a cold sweat prickle his forehead. He was in finance. He understood the words liquidity, sovereign debt, tranche distribution. But he had never, in his entire life, operated at this level. He dealt with hostile takeovers and leveraged buyouts, brutal but comparatively simple acts of financial predation. This man was casually redesigning the economic future of an entire region of the world. The Sahel Stability Accord was not just some vague UN program. It was a multi-billion-dollar initiative being hammered out in real time between this man and the White House. Penelope was paralyzed. Her mind frantically tried to process the cataclysmic social miscalculation she had made. They hadn't just been rude to a fellow passenger. They had mocked and insulted a man who was a direct advisor to the President of the United States. The potential fallout was terrifying and immeasurable. Her social standing, built on a fragile foundation of her husband's money and her own carefully cultivated snobbery, felt as if it were about to be swept away in a tsunami. Dr. Adebayo went on, his voice a steady, confident rhythm against the engine's hum. The pushback from the energy lobbyists will be significant, I understand that. But we can counter it. The data is on our side. The long-term ROI on renewable microgrids in the Sahel is projected at 12%, not even accounting for the geopolitical stability it fosters. It's not just a humanitarian issue, sir. It's a sound, fiscally conservative investment in global security. I can have the full data package on Secretary Peterson's desk by the time I land. He listened again, a small smile touching his lips. I'm glad you agree. Yes, the flight has been uneventful, perfectly comfortable. I look forward to our meeting at the Treasury tomorrow morning. My regards to the First Lady. Goodbye, Mr. President. He ended the call and handed the phone back to the purser, Robert, who accepted it with a slight bow of his head. Thank you, Robert. That was most efficient. Our pleasure, Dr. Adebayo, the purser replied, his voice filled with a newfound reverence. As the purser walked away, a profound and heavy silence settled over the cabin once more. It was a different kind of silence now, not of sleepy tranquility, but of stunned, collective awe. Every passenger was now acutely aware that they were sharing the cabin with someone of immense global significance. Their journey from London to Washington had been elevated from a simple flight to a historical footnote. Dr. Adebayo, with a composure that was almost superhuman, simply took a sip of his water, picked up his pen, and returned to the notes in his journal, as if he had just finished a casual chat with a colleague. This simple act was, in itself, the ultimate power move. It communicated that for him, a direct conversation with the president was a routine part of his workday. The spell was finally broken when the silver-haired man in 1A, whose name tag on his briefcase read Arthur Hawthorne, unbuckled his seatbelt and walked over to Dr. Adebayo's suite. He was the chairman of the board for a major multinational corporation and sat on the advisory council for several philanthropic foundations, a man whose quiet influence was felt in boardrooms from New York to Tokyo. He stood by the suite's entrance, his expression one of deep respect. Dr. Adebayo, he said, his voice clear and firm. Forgive the intrusion. My name is Arthur Hawthorne. I just wanted to say that I have followed your work on sustainable development for years. Your paper on the resource curse in sub-Saharan Africa was groundbreaking. It is an absolute honor to be on the same flight as you. Dr. Adebayo looked up, his face breaking into a genuinely warm smile. Mr. Hawthorne, the pleasure is all mine. Your company's recent commitment to carbon-neutral logistics is a commendable step in the right direction. Thank you for your kind words. They shook hands. It was a brief, simple exchange between two men of substance. But for the Sterlings, it was another nail in their social coffin. They hadn't just misjudged a man. They had revealed their own ignorance and boorishness in front of a peer, a man like Arthur Hawthorne, whose opinion in their world carried immense weight. The conversation had shaken the cabin, but for Richard and Penelope Sterling, it had shattered their world. The remaining hours of the flight would not be a journey to their destination, but a long, agonizing descent into a new reality they had created for themselves. The final 2 hours of the flight passed in an atmosphere as thin and cold as the air outside the fuselage. The dynamic of the first-class cabin had been irrevocably altered. Dr. Adebayo was no longer just a passenger in Suite 2A. He was the cabin's center of gravity. Other passengers would occasionally glance his way, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and profound respect. The cabin crew treated him with a level of deference usually reserved for royalty, every request anticipated, every need met before he even voiced it. For the Sterlings, the cabin had transformed from their personal playground into a torture chamber of their own making. They were prisoners of their own prejudice, sentenced to sit in agonizing silence with the evidence of their colossal error just across the aisle. Richard stared blankly at the flight map on his screen, the little icon of the airplane creeping with excruciating slowness towards the North American continent. He was replaying every sneering comment, every condescending laugh, and with each memory, a fresh wave of nausea washed over him. He was a man who prided himself on reading people, on finding their weaknesses. He had looked at Dr. Adebayo and seen nothing but a target for his contempt. He had never been more wrong, and the public nature of his failure was excruciating. Penelope seemed to have shrunk. She sat huddled in her seat, the Hermes bag ignored on the floor, her face pale and drawn. She avoided all eye contact, especially with Bethany and the other flight attendants, who now moved past her suite with an air of cool, professional disdain. She felt the weight of the other passengers' judgment like a physical pressure. The whispers she imagined were now about her. The looks of disgust from men like Arthur Hawthorne were a verdict on her character, and by extension, her social standing. As the captain announced their initial descent into the Washington area, a desperate panic began to set in for Penelope. She couldn't let it end like this. She had to try to fix it, to smooth it over. It was a social emergency of the highest order. With trembling hands, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stumbled to her feet. She crossed the aisle and stood hesitantly at the entrance to Dr. Adebayo's suite. He was looking out the window, watching the coastline of Virginia emerge from the clouds. "Dr. Adebayo," she began, her voice a reedy, unfamiliar squeak. He turned his head slowly, his expression neutral, patient. I wanted to apologize," she stammered, twisting her hands together. "My husband and I, we were terribly out of line earlier. We didn't realize who you were." The words hung in the air, a confession not of remorse for their behavior, but of regret for their miscalculation. It was an apology for getting caught, not for the offense itself. Dr. Adebayo looked at her, his gaze steady and deeply penetrating. There was no anger in his eyes, but something far more devastating. Disappointment. He was silent for a long moment, letting her words and their pathetic implication settle in the space between them. "Mrs. Sterling," he finally said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight of moral authority. "I appreciate the sentiment behind your apology, but I'm afraid you have fundamentally misunderstood the problem." Penelope blinked, confused. I don't understand." "You are apologizing because you discovered my identity," he explained, his voice remaining perfectly calm. "You are not apologizing for mocking a man's accent, for belittling his presence, or for assuming his inferiority. Your apology is conditional. It is based on the fact that your target turned out to be someone of influence. This implies that had I been a man of no importance, a school teacher, a small business owner, a tourist who had saved his entire life for this ticket, your behavior would have been, in your eyes, acceptable. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. My identity is not the issue here. Your character is. You judged a man not by his worth, but by your own narrow prejudice. Who I am should not determine whether I am worthy of your basic human decency. That should be afforded to everyone. He delivered the words without a trace of malice. It was not an attack. It was a clinical, irrefutable diagnosis of a moral failing. Each word was a perfectly placed stone, building a wall of principle that her flimsy apology could not breach. So no, he concluded softly. I cannot accept your apology, because it is not offered for the actual offense. The offense was not in disrespecting me, Canaan Adebayo. The offense was in your willingness to disrespect a stranger you deemed beneath you. That is an issue you must reconcile with yourself, not with me. He then turned back to the window, his message clear. The conversation was over. Penelope Sterling stood frozen for a moment, her face a mask of utter humiliation. She had been dismissed. Not angrily, not vengefully, but with a calm, intellectual precision that was more cutting than any tirade. She turned and walked back to her seat in a daze, slumping into the leather as if her bones had dissolved. She had sought absolution and had received a life lesson instead. The plane banked, its wings tilting as it lined up for its final approach into Dulles International Airport. The descent was no longer just a physical process. For the Sterlings, it was a terrifyingly icy plunge from their perch of assumed superiority into a cold, harsh new reality, where their money meant nothing and their character meant everything. And theirs had just been weighed and found wanting. The arrival at Washington Dulles was swift and anticlimactic. Dr. Adebayo was the first person off the plane, greeted at the jet bridge not by a throng of reporters, but by two discreet men in dark suits who nodded respectfully and addressed him as Dr. Adebayo before whisking him away towards a waiting black car on the tarmac. It was a quiet, seamless display of importance that underscored everything the Sterlings had just learned. Richard and Penelope collected their luggage in a fog of dread. Arthur Hawthorne, the board chairman from seat 1A, passed them at baggage claim. He didn't say a word, but he gave Richard a long, appraising look. It was not a look of anger. It was a look of evaluation, the kind a man gives to a stock he is about to divest from his portfolio. It was a look that chilled Richard to the bone. The karma, when it came, was not a lightning bolt from the heavens. It was a quiet, systemic unraveling, a death by 1,000 cuts in the insular, interconnected world of high finance, where reputation is the only true currency. It began 3 days later. Richard was in a board meeting for a major charitable foundation on whose board he sat, a position he used more for networking and image laundering than for actual philanthropy. Arthur Hawthorne was also on that board. During a discussion about funding a new educational initiative in West Africa, Hawthorne spoke up. I believe, Hawthorne said, his voice carrying the weight of his authority, that before we proceed, we should re-evaluate the core values of this board. Our mission is to uplift and empower. That requires a fundamental respect for human dignity. I, for one, would find it difficult to sit at a table with individuals who demonstrate a profound lack of that respect in their personal conduct. He didn't name Richard, but every eye in the room swiveled to him. The story of the flight, Richard realized with a sickening lurch, had been quietly circulating. 2 weeks later, he was politely asked to tender his resignation from the board. The first real financial blow came a month after the flight. Sterling Capital, Richard's firm, was in the final stages of securing a massive 9-figure investment from a Swiss pension fund. The deal was all but signed. Then, abruptly, the fund's managers went silent. After a week of unreturned calls, Richard finally got the fund's chief investment officer on the phone. "I'm sorry, Richard," the man said, his voice cool and distant. "We've decided to move in a different direction. We have concerns about a potential character mismatch with your firm's leadership." "Character mismatch?" Richard sputtered. "What the hell does that mean? Our returns are in the top 5%. Our stakeholders are increasingly concerned with ESG principles, environmental, social, and governance," the CIO replied smoothly. "The S and the G are particularly important. We need to have confidence in the judgment and moral compass of the people managing our money. We no longer have that confidence. The decision is final." The call ended. Richard slammed the phone down, his mind racing. He knew, with absolute certainty, where this had come from. The world of pension funds and institutional investors was small. A word from a man like Arthur Hawthorne, who likely had connections to the Swiss fund's board, was all it would take. The true cataclysm, however, was tied directly to Dr. Adebayo's work. One morning, the front page of the Wall Street Journal featured a major story on the Sahel Stability Accord. The article hailed it as a revolutionary piece of economic statecraft, a plan that would reshape the investment landscape across Africa for a generation. It detailed a multi-billion-dollar shift away from fossil fuels and extractive industries and towards sustainable green infrastructure. And it named the architect of the plan, the Nigerian-born, Oxford-educated economist and recent Nobel laureate Dr. Kenan Adebayo. Richard read the article, and the blood drained from his face. Nobel laureate. He had mocked a Nobel laureate. But the horror was just beginning. He scrolled down to the details of the Accord's funding mechanisms and corporate partnerships. And then he saw it. The Accord was backed by a coalition of the world's most powerful ethical investment funds and development banks. The policies it enacted would systematically devalue the very industries sterling capital was most heavily invested in: oil exploration rights in Nigeria, mining concessions in the Congo, and aging, carbon-heavy power plants across the continent. Dr. Adebayo's plan wasn't just a humanitarian triumph. It was a dagger pointed at the heart of Richard's portfolio. The day the Accord was formally signed at the White House, the market reacted. The stocks for the companies in Richard's portfolio plummeted. His phone began ringing off the hook with calls from panicked investors. The whispers that had started with Arthur Hawthorne had grown into a roar. Investors weren't just concerned about his character, they were now terrified of his judgment. He had bet big on a dying model of exploitative economics, while the rest of the world, guided by men like Adebayo, was moving on. Margin calls began. The funds he managed were leveraged to the hilt, and as the value of his assets collapsed, the banks came calling for their money. Within 6 weeks, sterling capital was in a death spiral. Investors were pulling out in a stampede. The Swiss pension fund's rejection had been the first tremor. The Sahel Accord was the earthquake that brought the entire edifice crashing down. The unraveling was swift, brutal, and total. The fall was not a sudden, clean break, but a slow, grinding erosion that wore them down to nothing. 6 months after the flight, the name Sterling, once synonymous with ruthless success, was now a cautionary tale whispered in the boardrooms and country clubs they were no longer welcomes in. Sterling capital had imploded in a firestorm of withdrawn investments and margin calls, a collapse so total it left nothing but scorched earth and staggering debt. Their life, once a monument to opulent excess, was now a ruin, and they were its 2 haunted inhabitants. For Penelope, The loss was a kind of death. Her identity had been so inextricably woven into the fabric of Richard's wealth that without it, she ceased to exist. Her days were a long, silent scream into a void that no longer noticed her. One afternoon, driven by a desperate, pathetic hope, she called a woman named Catherine, who had once been her closest confidant, the co-chair of her charities, her partner in social conquest. After 3 rings, Catherine answered, her voice clipped and cool. "Penelope," she said, the name sounding foreign and unpleasant in her mouth. "I'm surprised to hear from you." "Catherine, darling," Penelope began, forcing a lightness into her voice that felt like swallowing glass. "I was just thinking of you. It's been ages. I was wondering if you might be free for lunch next week. Perhaps at Le Bernardin?" A cold silence stretched across the line. "I don't think that would be a good idea," Catherine said finally, the practiced politeness of their class doing little to hide the brutal dismissal. "Things are very busy. You understand." Penelope did understand. She understood that she was no longer a person, but a contagion, a reminder of a failure so spectacular that it was socially communicable. "Of course," she whispered, her throat closing up. "Another time, perhaps." "Goodbye, Penelope," Catherine said, and hung up. That evening, with the gas bill overdue, Penelope found herself standing in front of a grimy, bulletproof window in a pawn shop on the Lower East Side. She slid a diamond tennis bracelet across the counter, a piece Richard had given her for their 10th anniversary. The pawnbroker, a man with weary, indifferent eyes, barely glanced at it before naming a number that was less than the cost of the handbag she had once carried. She took the cash, her hands trembling, and walked out into the dirty city streets, feeling the phantom weight of the diamonds on her wrist replaced by the crushing burden of her new reality. Her life had been a performance, and the stage had been unceremoniously dismantled. For Richard, the ruin was different. It was a public castration. The mechanism of his destruction had been far more direct and personal than mere market forces. On that flight, sitting in seat 4A, had been Eleanor Vance, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist for a major financial journal, a woman with a bulldog's tenacity and a deep-seated contempt for corporate bullies. She had witnessed the entire ugly drama, from the initial sneers to the horrifying silence after the president's call. While other passengers saw a karmic reversal, Eleanor saw a thread. She knew that the kind of arrogance and willful blindness the Sterlings displayed rarely confined itself to personal interactions. It was a character flaw that often seeped into business practices. Her disgust propelled her to action. She began digging into Sterling capital. For weeks, she disappeared down a rabbit hole of offshore accounts, shell corporations, and convoluted derivatives. She discovered what the market had overlooked in its thirst for high returns. Richard's entire flagship fund was a house of cards, built on dangerously over-leveraged positions in volatile, ethically dubious industries. More damningly, she uncovered a pattern of misleading reports to investors, fudging numbers just enough to stay on the right side of the law, but the wrong side of the truth. Her article, published on a Monday morning, landed like a tactical nuke. The headline was devastating. The arrogance of the asset class inside the bigoted world and brittle fortune of Richard Sterling. It opened not with financial data, but with a vivid, detailed account of his behavior on Flight 214, using him as the poster child for a culture of insulated, unaccountable greed. The story then masterfully connected his personal bigotry to his professional recklessness, painting a portrait of a man so convinced of his own superiority that he believed he was immune to consequence, both social and financial. The article didn't just report on his firm's collapse. It triggered the final, fatal avalanche. It gave every nervous investor the justification they needed to pull their money out, and they did so in a single, catastrophic stampede. A year after the flight, Richard Sterling was working as a stockroom clerk at a high-end bookstore in Washington, D.C. He had fled New York, unable to bear the whispers and stares. Through a temp agency that didn't ask too many questions, he'd found this menial, anonymous job. He spent his days lifting heavy boxes of books, his hands, once soft from a life of leisure, now calloused and sore. The pay was barely enough to cover the rent on their grim, one-bedroom apartment in Arlington. One crisp autumn afternoon, the bell above the bookstore's door chimed. Richard was in the history aisle, shelving a new shipment of biographies, his back aching. He heard distinguished, familiar voices approaching. And so the challenge is not simply funding the infrastructure, but ensuring the governance models are in place to manage it effectively for generations, one voice said. It was a rich, melodic baritone with a unique, unforgettable cadence. Richard froze, his hand hovering over a spine. He peered through a gap in the shelves. There, standing in the middle of the store, was Dr. Kenan Adebayo. He looked exactly the same, radiating a quiet, confident energy. He was now a distinguished visiting professor at Georgetown University, and with him was the university's president. They were laughing, deep in a conversation about global policy, their minds grappling with the fate of nations. "Kenan, we're so fortunate to have you with us this semester," the university president said. "The students are absolutely electrified. The enrollment for your seminar on post-colonial economics had a wait list of over 200. "The honor is all mine," Dr. Adebayo replied, with his characteristic warmth. "To engage with such bright young minds is a privilege. Now, I believe the books I ordered should be waiting for me." Richard felt the air leave his lungs. He ducked back behind the shelf, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was a clerk, a stock boy. He was here to shelve the very books that this man, the man he had ridiculed and dismissed as a worthless simpleton, would be using to educate the next generation of world leaders. The chasm between their realities was absolute and terrifying. He heard them move towards the front counter, their conversation shifting to the logistics of an upcoming lecture in Berlin. Richard stayed hidden in the aisle, surrounded by the stories of great men, feeling smaller and more insignificant than he had ever thought possible. It was the ultimate karma, delivered not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating mundanity of a chance encounter in a bookstore. He was a footnote in a life he had once tried to edit. That night, he returned to the apartment. The air was thick with the silence of shared despair. Penelope was on the sofa, staring blankly at the flickering television, a ghost in a rented room. She didn't look up when he came in. They no longer had conversations. They just occupied the same space, their resentment a palpable third presence in the room. He sat down in the threadbare armchair, the silence stretching between them. He thought of the numbers that had once defined his life: market caps, stock prices, profit margins, net worth. He had been a master of that language. But he understood now that he had been illiterate in the only language that mattered. He had spent his entire life meticulously building a balance sheet of assets, believing it was the final measure of a man. Now, in the quiet ruin of his life, he finally calculated the true and final ledger. On the asset side, there was nothing, not a single thing of lasting value. On the liability side, there was a debt of character so vast it was unpayable, a lifetime of arrogance, a mountain of prejudice, a profound cruelty that had poisoned everything it touched. It was a debt owed not to the market, not to his investors, but to the very idea of human decency. He looked over at Penelope, at her empty eyes. and he saw his own reflection. They were both bankrupt. Their marriage, their future, their souls. The final balance sheet was in, and the bottom line was a void. The story you just heard isn't just about drama on an airplane. It's a powerful reminder that in our interconnected world, character is the ultimate currency. The Sterlings lost their fortune, but their real bankruptcy was one of spirit, a poverty of decency that cost them everything. Dr. Adebayo's victory wasn't just in being right. It was in his unshakable dignity and his focus on building a better world, proving that true influence isn't loud and boastful, but quiet, profound, and impactful. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that character and respect are more valuable than any price tag, then please help us share this message. Hit that like button to let us know it made an impact. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that explore the moments that define us. Click the notification bell so you never miss a lesson in life's most powerful truths. Thank you for listening.